2005 was one of the most important years in gaming history, as it was the year when the 7th generation of game consoles officially began, with the release of Microsoft's second home console, the Xbox 360, in November 2005. Microsoft came out of the gate swinging with their first console, the original Xbox, released in 2001, managing to outperform both Sega and Nintendo's home consoles in that generation, the Dreamcast and the GameCube respectively, which is really crazy to think about, as only a decade earlier, Sega and Nintendo were on top of the home console world. Personally though, I feel like Microsoft really hit their stride with the Xbox 360. The Xbox 360's launch library looking back was pretty alright. You had a handful of brand new exclusives with a substantial number of games that were already out. Though to be fair, most of these games were still relatively new at the time, usually no more than 2 months old. And you did get the benefit of next-gen hardware compared to the last-gen versions of the games. Luckily, the 360's library would get significantly more well-rounded next year with the release of games like Capcom's Dead Rising and Epic Games' Gears of War, but that's for another video. 2005 gave us another new console, the Game Boy Micro, released in September of that year. The Game Boy Micro is essentially an even smaller version of the handheld Game Boy Advance with a backlight, making the screen brighter and easier to see. Outside of the smaller form factor and the brighter screen, the other key selling point of the Micro was the customization options. The Game Boy Micro has a removable faceplate, allowing you to use different plates to give your system its own unique look. It's honestly a neat little gimmick. Outside of like stickers, there weren't a ton of ways to customize Nintendo handhelds before this, so it is kinda cool. Unfortunately, the Game Boy Micro had a pretty noticeable issue, and that was the lack of backwards compatibility. Nintendo released the Game Boy Advance in 2001, and then they released an updated clamshell redesign of the GBA called the Game Boy Advance SP in 2003. Both the GBA and the GBA SP have the ability to play games released for Nintendo's earlier handheld consoles, the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color, meaning that you can play games from 3 different consoles on one device. It was a really great bang for your buck. Sadly, the Game Boy Micro lacks the ability to play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. You can only play Game Boy Advance games. Keep in mind, when this thing came out, it wasn't a budget console or anything. It was priced at $100, which at the time was more than the Game Boy Advance and the SP, which had already gotten price cuts. You were effectively paying more money for a product that could play less games. The Game Boy Micro's backlight would be a decent enough reason to buy it, but Nintendo ended up releasing the AGS-101 model of the GBA SP, which came with a backlit screen. One cool thing is that the Micro does have a headphone jack, which strangely the SP doesn't have, even though the OG GBA has one. But even so, the Micro lacking backwards compatibility was a weird decision. It was an especially weird decision to release the Game Boy Micro, because one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that Nintendo's new handheld, the Nintendo DS, had already been released last year. And what's even more baffling is that the DS can play Game Boy Advance games. If the DS could only play DS games and the Game Boy Micro was released as a budget console for, say, $60, I could totally see a market for this thing. You have the DS as the fancy new console, the GBA SP as the mid-tier console for those that want to still play the older games, and the Micro for people with kids or people who want to save a couple bucks and don't necessarily care about all the touchscreen stuff on the DS or the old games on the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. But of course, all of that is just hypothetical. In reality, I don't know who the Game Boy Micro was for, and apparently no one else did because the console did not sell particularly well. It was discontinued in 2008, not even lasting as long as its older brother, the Game Boy Advance SP. 2005 really felt like the last year of the Game Boy Advance. Notable GBA games like Mother 3 and Rhythm Tengoku still came out well into 2006, but those games were Japan exclusives. In terms of big GBA releases, I mean, there was Mario Party Advance. It's notable for being the very first portable Mario Party game, but besides that, it's pretty widely regarded as the worst Mario Party game, and one of the worst Mario games ever made. It's weird in that it's a Mario Party game with a focus on single player, when the whole appeal of Mario Party is playing with friends. Besides Mario Party Advance, there also was Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team, the first game in the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon spin-off series, along with Blue Rescue Team, released on the DS. The Mystery Dungeon series began back in 1993 with the Super Nintendo roguelike dungeon crawler, Torneco's Great Adventure Mystery Dungeon. This game is actually a spin-off of the Dragon Quest series of RPGs, and in the game you play as the merchant Torneko from Dragon Quest IV as he looks for items to sell by going dungeon crawling. The Mystery Dungeon games are a series of roguelikes developed by Chunsoft and later Spike Chunsoft, who you may know from the Danganronpa series. The Mystery Dungeon games are similar to Koei Tecmo's Dynasty Warriors games in that many games in the franchise were made based on other existing IPs. For example, the original Mystery Dungeon was based on Dragon Quest, but later there would be Chocobo's Mysterious Dungeon based on Square Enix's Final Fantasy RPG series, The Nightmare of Druaga based on Namco's Babylonian Castle Saga series that started in 1984 with the Tower of Druaga, and Etrian Mystery Dungeon based on Atlus's Etrian Odyssey Dungeon Crawler series. The Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series is a similar style of roguelike where you go through various randomized dungeons battling Pokemon, but the interesting thing about these games is that instead of playing as a Pokemon trainer, you play as the Pokemon themselves. The games start with a brief personality test to determine which Pokemon you play the rest of the game as. The story has you, a human turned into a Pokemon, starting a rescue team, a group of Pokemon who go out into dangerous situations to rescue helpless Pokemon and complete other odd jobs. Instead of catching Pokemon, you can recruit Pokemon to join your team, thus strengthening your combat power. As I briefly mentioned before, there were two different versions of the first Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, Red Rescue Team on the GBA and Blue Rescue Team on the DS. Releasing two versions of the same game with minor differences was and continues to be a staple of the Pokemon series, but the Rescue Team games are interesting in that they were released on different consoles. One really cool feature is that you can connect Blue Rescue Team to Red Rescue Team by putting a copy of Blue Rescue Team into the DS cartridge slot on your DS console and putting a copy of Red Rescue Team into the GBA slot of your DS console. There weren't a ton of connectivity features for the Rescue Team games, but one pretty cool feature is that by going to the Makuhita Dojo in Blue Rescue Team, you can battle your team from Red Rescue Team. DS to GBA connectivity was a really awesome idea that I only remember the Pokemon games really taking advantage of. This was during that weird 3 pillars era of Nintendo, when they were trying to support the GBA, the DS, and the GameCube all at the same time. To be honest though, I can kinda understand why they went with this weird strategy. Keep in mind, this was less than a decade after the failure of the weird pseudo 3D Virtual Boy console that Nintendo made. So Nintendo was probably a little skeptical about putting all of their eggs into the DS's basket. Instead, they decided to do the whole 3 pillars thing where they said, you know, it will still support the GBA, but you know, we'll have the DS too, and of course there's always the GameCube. Speaking of the GameCube, let's talk about some of the games that came out for that system next. Probably the biggest release of the year was
Resident Evil 4.
Resident Evil 4 is an incredibly important game for the Resident Evil series, as it substantially changed the gameplay style that the series had been known for. Prior to RE4, the Resident Evil series primarily used fixed camera angles, with pre-rendered 3D backgrounds. However, Resident Evil 4 opted for an over-the-shoulder viewing angle in full 3D, a camera style that would become extremely popular and widespread even 20 years later. RE4 follows Leon S. Kennedy, one of the playable characters from Resident Evil 2, released 7 years earlier in 1998 on the PlayStation. Leon has been sent on a mission in Europe to rescue the president's daughter, Ashley, leading him to a battle against a village of people who seem to be infected with some strange disease that makes them really want to kill him. Resident Evil 4 is famous for really ramping up the over-the-top action, as opposed to the slower-paced, older Resident Evil games, but to be honest, the series had steadily been getting crazier over the years, so this is more of a natural progression more than anything. However, even with the game being faster paced and action heavy, it still managed to maintain some of its survival horror roots with its limited resources, inventory management, and foreboding atmosphere. In any case, Resident Evil 4 was well received by fans and reviewers alike thanks to its great gameplay, great cinematography, great voice acting, well, everything really. This game was pretty universally acclaimed, although surprisingly, the game didn't sell as well as you'd expect from how esteemed it was, and that's probably because of the console it was released on, the GameCube. The GameCube is historically one of Nintendo's less successful home consoles. Thankfully, RE4 got ported to various different consoles like the PS2 and the Wii, leading to the game having much larger sales, to the point where, to this day, RE4 is still one of Capcom's best-selling games of all time, with over 14 million units sold. Capcom was actually one of the biggest supporters of the GameCube. They had a lineup of games made for the GameCube called the Capcom 5. which included the aforementioned Resident Evil 4, a futuristic third-person shooter called PNO3, released in 2003, the stylish beat-em-up Beautiful Joe, released in 2003, as well as Suda51 and Grasshopper Manufacture's surreal on-rail shooter Killer 7, which released in 2005. Now, maybe you can't count, but if you can, then you probably realized that's only 4 games. And that's because the last game, a fantasy flight shooter called Dead Phoenix, ended up being cancelled. The Beautiful Joe series got 2 new entries in 2005, Beautiful Joe Double Trouble for the DS, and Beautiful Joe Red Hot Rumble for the GameCube and later the PSP. Red Hot Rumble is pretty interesting as it's a platform fighter akin to Super Smash Bros, but even more interestingly, the North American GameCube version of the game has in-game ads for Johnny Rockets, a chain of restaurants designed in the style of 1950s American diners, serving dishes like burgers, fries, and milkshakes. Sadly, these would be the last Beautiful Joe games. It seemed like for a while Capcom was trying to make this thing a franchise, even getting a manga and an anime made for the series, which was animated by Group TAC, an animation studio who worked on several other anime adaptations of another one of Capcom's video game series, Street Fighter, including the acclaimed Street Fighter II movie. Outside of the Capcom stuff, some other notable GameCube releases this year included the first 3D Fire Emblem game, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, which was also the debut of fan-favorite character Ike. Another big GameCube release of 2005 was Star Fox Assault, the last home console Star Fox game until Star Fox Zero on the Wii U in 2016. After Star Fox Adventures drastically changed the gameplay style to an on-foot action-adventure game, Star Fox Assault brought the series a bit closer to its roots by bringing back the space shooting and vehicular combat that the series was known for, while still allowing for some boots-on-the-ground action. Star Fox Assault was published by Nintendo, but it was developed by Namco, notable because this was the same year that Namco had begun its merger with Bandai, which eventually led to the formation of the company Bandai Namco that we all know today. Of course, given that the GameCube is a Nintendo console, there were bound to be a ton of Mario games on the system. In fact, 2005 as a whole was a really big year for Mario. I already mentioned Mario Party Advance, but there was also Mario Party 7, a far more positively received Mario Party game released on the GameCube. The first Mario baseball game, Mario Superstar Baseball, released this year on the GameCube as well. This was a year of firsts, as this year also gave the world the first Mario soccer game, Super Mario Strikers, developed by Next Level Games, who would later go on to make the Punch-Out Wii game and Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon. The Mario Strikers series became memorable amongst Mario fans for its edgier art style, more aggressive sports gameplay, and its sometimes raunchier vibe. Super Mario Strikers' release makes a lot of sense when you remember that the late 90s and early 2000s was a time when extreme and street sports were getting really popular, and that impact was felt in video games as well. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, NFL Blitz, NBA Street. All of these games were less focused on making an accurate depiction of the sports that you were participating in, and were more about just being cool, which I think really fits Super Mario Strikers' MO as well. Some of the other notable Mario games released this year include Mario & Luigi Partners in Time, the second game in the Mario & Luigi RPG series developed by Alpha Dream, and Mario Kart DS, which launched alongside the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection, allowing Nintendo DS users to play games with each other online. Having built-in free online was and still is an incredible feature. Even nowadays, for most game consoles, you need to buy some sort of subscription plan to play online, so getting it for free back then was awesome. While I didn't play Mario Kart DS online, I played a ton of it via the DS Download Play service. DS Download Play allows you to play local multiplayer with up to 8 players, even if the other 7 people don't have the game cartridge. As long as one person owns the game, all 8 people can play. Of course, there are limitations, like you can't play all of the courses, but still, there is plenty of fun to be had. There was also Super Princess Peach, a Mario spin-off where the roles are reversed, and Princess Peach has to save Mario. It was really cool that Peach got her day in the limelight, something that wouldn't really happen again until 18 years later with Princess Peach Showtime. Probably the strangest Mario game released that year was Dance Dance Revolution Mario Mix. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, DDR was all the rage. This was a time when rhythm games were still a fairly new thing, and DDR brought a cool twist. Instead of using a controller, you had to use your feet to tap buttons on a dance pad. But even then, a DDR crossover with Mario was pretty odd. The game even has a story mode where Waluigi breaks into Truffle Towers, causing these items called the Music Keys, which have the power of music, to be spread all over the Mushroom Kingdom. You can play as Mario or Luigi, and you use the power of dance to stop all of the bad guys and return the music keys to their rightful place. Given that this is a rhythm game, the game of course has a ton of music. Notably a ton of remixes of Mario songs and even remixes of classical music. Some of these songs are insane. There's a Eurobeat remix of the athletic theme from Super Mario Bros. 3 and a disco remix of the Turkish March by Wolfgang Mozart. Probably my favorite track from the game is the song from the Waluigi Battle Destruction Dance, which is a remix of the bonus stage theme from Nintendo's 1985 NES game, Wrecking Crew. This game is absurd. Like, if I didn't know this was a real official Nintendo game, I would have thought that this was some sort of dank meme video made in Source Filmmaker or something. DDR Mario Mix wasn't the only notable rhythm game to come out in 2005, as this was also the year that the Japan-exclusive game Os Tatakai Ouendan, developed by iNIS Interactive, would release on the DS, a rhythm game about a group of cheerleaders. By tapping, sliding, and spinning the stylus around on the DS's touchscreen, you can cheer for a variety of different people who are going through difficult times in their life, and by performing the songs well, you can help them attain a brighter future. If this game looks familiar, that's because it would get a sort of sequel in Elite Beat Agents, which released the following year in 2006 in North America, Europe, and Australia. This game is very similar to OTO, but instead of being about a cheer squad, it's about a group of government agents who go around cheering for people. OTO was pretty rooted in Japanese culture. In fact, the songs in the game were covers of popular songs by Japanese artists, like the song for the first level of the game is Loopin' Loop by Asian Kung Fu Generation, who you may know for doing the second opening song from the 2002 Naruto anime Haruka Kanata, which was used during the Chunin exams arc of the show. The song for the 14th level of the game is Shanghai Honey by Orange Range, who you may know for doing the first opening song from the 2004 Bleach anime Asterisk, which was used for the substitute Shinigami arc of the show. By contrast, Elite Beat Agents was a lot more westernized, even featuring popular songs in America. Here are just a handful of the songs in the game. September by Earth, Wind & Fire, Material Girl by Madonna, Jumping Jack Flash by the Rolling Stones, Survivor by Destiny's Child, and YMCA by the Village People. I find it really cool how both OTO and Elite Beat Agents use songs that were popular or culturally relevant to their respective audiences. Of course, you can't talk about 2005 rhythm games without mentioning Guitar Hero. Guitar Hero was released on the PS2 and it was developed by Harmonix, who would later go on to develop the Rock Band series, which started in 2007. DDR Mario Mix uses a dance pad for its gameplay, and Os Tatakai Ouendan uses a stylus, but Guitar Hero uses a guitar-shaped controller. For all intents and purposes, Guitar Hero is a pretty straightforward rhythm game. You press buttons on the guitar at the right time to play the music, but the game surprisingly became a smash hit. And when I say a smash hit, I mean it became a cultural phenomenon. In the mid to late 2000s, it seemed like every other household had one of these plastic guitars lying around. A part of the success of Guitar Hero was likely because of the track list. Rhythm games live and die by their music, and Guitar Hero manages to deliver an impressive nearly 50-song track list of covers of popular rock songs, even featuring some really famous tracks like Smoke on the Water by Deep Purple and Killer Queen by Queen. Another reason why I think Guitar Hero was successful was, well, guitars are cool. Rhythm games tend to be pretty quirky and kinda weird. Guitar Hero, on the other hand, was rad. It was hardcore. It was rock and roll. 2005 really was a time when everyone was trying to be hardcore and mature and controversial. These games were usually filled with cursing, guns, and dark or raunchy humor. You had games like True Crime New York City, The Punisher, 50 Cent Bulletproof, and so on and so on. This boom in mature games was very likely in part because of the success of Rockstar's Grand Theft Auto series. GTA didn't get a major release this year, but Rockstar did release Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories on the PSP, a prequel to 2001's GTA 3. Liberty City Stories is pretty notable for being the first 3D GTA game on a handheld. Nowadays, this doesn't look impressive, but you gotta remember, this was 2005. In literally the previous year, 2004, this is what a portable GTA game looked like. The PSP isn't as powerful as the PS2, but they still managed to deliver a home console scale GTA game on a handheld device, which was pretty impressive for the time. There actually were quite a few popular franchises on PlayStation consoles that got PSP games in 2005. Twisted Metal got a new title, Twisted Metal Head-On, Ape Escape got a remake called Ape Escape on the Loose, and Medieval got a remake called Medieval Resurrection. Speaking of handheld games, let's take a look at some other notable handheld games of the year. Earlier I mentioned Elite Beat Agents wouldn't come out until 2006. However, the brand that Elite Beat Agents was under was called Touch Generations, which started in 2005. Touch Generations was a brand that Nintendo gave to games on the DS and later the Wii that were targeted at a more casual audience. For many years, and even nowadays to some extent, gaming has had that negative stereotype of being a hobby for kids, nerdy guys, or annoying frat boys. This was especially the case in the mid-2000s because, like I mentioned before, gaming had become a lot more hardcore and raunchy around that time. Nintendo realized this, and so they started the Touch Generations brand as a way to get people from all different walks of life to enjoy games. Some of the early Touch Generation games include Brain Age, Big Brain Academy, and Nintendogs. Brain Age is a pretty simple brain teaser type of game where you do things like solve math problems, memorize numbers, or count people in a scenario. You then get a score for how sharp your mind is, which you can then use to compare with your friends. Big Brain Academy is honestly more or less the same kind of deal as Brain Age, a bunch of puzzles to test how big your brain is. Big Brain Academy is a bit more silly and colorful than Brain Age, and it also features a larger variety of minigames. Apparently, Big Brain Academy also has a 2-player versus mode, which sounds pretty fun, although I never personally got to play it. The Touch Generations game that I put a ton of time into back in the day was Nintendogs. Nintendogs is a pet simulation game where you can raise a bunch of different dogs. Yeah, that's it. You pet them, you feed them, take them out for walks, all that kind of stuff. It's insanely simple, but that's a part of the appeal of the game and the Touch Generations brand as a whole. It's a straightforward, easy game that even your grandma could play. Probably the most interesting thing about Nintendogs is that it went to the Pokemon school of marketing, opting to get released in multiple different versions. The original 3 versions were Nintendogs Chihuahua and Friends, Dachshund and Friends, and Shiba Inu and Friends. When the game was brought over to North America and other Western regions, Shiba Inu and Friends was changed to Labrador and Friends. Like the Pokemon games, the different versions of Nintendogs have exclusive content. Different items like toys, clothes for your dogs, and music tracks are exclusive to each of the different versions. But you can obtain items from the versions that you don't have by connecting with the other versions of the game via multiplayer. Another big difference is that the starting breeds for each version are different. For example, Huskies are available at the start in Dachshund and Friends, Yorkies are available at the start in Chihuahua and Friends, and Corgis are available at the start of Lab and Friends. Just like Pokemon, another version of Nintendogs will be released not long after the first set of games dropped. That version is Nintendogs Best Friends. This game features a unique lineup of starting breeds, including Yorkies, Labs, and German Shepherds. Nintendogs was really a phenomenon when it came out, but it wasn't the only super popular animal-related game in 2005. 2005 also gave the world Animal Crossing Wild World. The Animal Crossing games are a series of life sims where you control a human who starts a new life in a town filled with talking animals. You can talk to your neighbors, decorate your house, go fishing, and just vibe. The original Animal Crossing had a number of different versions, but Animal Crossing Wild World was the first proper sequel to the first game. Wild World introduced a bunch of new stuff like new villagers, new holidays, and new items, but arguably the most important new feature was concurrent multiplayer. In the original Animal Crossing, there was multiplayer in a sense. You could have multiple players living in the same town, but you couldn't be in the game at the same time as someone else. You'd have to leave the game so someone else could join and see all the things that you did while they were away. Wild World upped the ante by allowing players to play simultaneously, via local play or via the at the time new Nintendo Wi-Fi connection. But enough about silly casual games, let's get into the serious stuff. 2005 featured a number of action games like Capcom's high-octane Combo Fest Devil May Cry 3, Santa Monica Studios' chaotic Greek mythology-inspired God of War, and Team Ico's giant-scaling epic Shadow of the Colossus. The PlayStation 2 is filled to the brim with action games, one of the particularly interesting ones being Sega's Yakuza, aka Like a Dragon. Yakuza was developed by a team within Sega now known as Ryuga Gotoku Studio, but over the years they went by different names and had a ton of restructuring. At one time they were called Amusement Vision, and they developed games like Super Monkey Ball and F-Zero GX. and some of the people involved were a part of another Sega division called Smilebit, who worked on the Jet Set Radio games. However, when Yakuza was released, none of their unique branding was there, and it wouldn't be until Binary Domains development that they go by their Ryuga Gotoku Studio moniker. In Yakuza, you play as Kazuma Kiryu, a member of a Japanese gang called the Dojima clan, who returns home after spending 10 years in prison. Yakuza is an open-world game akin to GTA, but it places a bigger emphasis on hand-to-hand combat. You gain experience points which you can use to further strengthen Kiryu and unlock new techniques. Yakuza is set in Kamurocho, a fictional city in Japan, and the game does a really good job at making the town feel like a living, breathing place. Many of the stores in the game you can actually go inside. There are a ton of strange and over-the-top side characters who will give you missions to do. You can be a bouncer for a hostess club, play baseball with a washed-up pitcher, or accept a briefcase filled with definitely not dirty money from some weird guy. When Yakuza was released in the West, it got an English dub which features some pretty interesting vocal talent. The little girl that Kiryu looks after, Haruka, is voiced by Debbie Derry Barry, the voice of Jimmy Neutron. And the voice actor for Kiryu's rival Goro Majima is Mark Hamill. You know, the voice of the Joker in various Batman cartoons and games, and also the guy who played Luke Skywalker from Star Wars. Speaking of Star Wars, 2005 was the year when the last of the 3 prequel movies came out, Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. So you know they had to release a ton of games to tie in with the film. 2005 saw the release of the Star Wars Episode 3 movie game, Star Wars Battlefront 2, and LEGO Star Wars. The console versions of the Episode 3 game were developed by The Collective, who've made a number of other licensed games, but the handheld versions were developed by Ubisoft. I've never played the Episode 3 game, so I can't speak on its quality, but one interesting fact about the game is that the PS2 and Xbox versions have an alternate ending. Spoilers if you haven't seen Star Wars Episode 3, but of course in the original movie, Anakin turns evil and gets defeated by his master, Obi-Wan, leading him to become Darth Vader. However, in this game, you can play as Anakin in a special mission and have him defeat Obi-Wan. Anakin then kills Palpatine, and I guess he then just takes over the galaxy or something. Star Wars Battlefront 2 was developed by Pandemic Studios, who made Destroy All Humans, another game that came out in 2005. Battlefront 2 is a classic shooter from this generation. Like you might expect, it added more vehicles, maps, and stuff that weren't in the first game. But easily, the most memorable part of Battlefront 2 is the new playable hero characters. You can play as famous characters from the Star Wars series, like Han Solo, Mace Windu, Yoda, Princess Leia, and Darth Maul. I was a fan of the Star Wars Battlefront games, but I was really into LEGO Star Wars. In fact, I think LEGO Star Wars might have been the first game I ever went out of my way to 100%. LEGO Star Wars is essentially a retelling of the 3 prequel movies, but with everything being made out of Legos. Characters, ships, worlds, everything. The game is an action platformer where you go through missions based on events from the 3 movies. The game has a silly sense of humor, which contrasts well with the outside of Jar Jar Binks' very serious prequel movies. Different characters have different abilities, and you'll often have to solve puzzles by using the right character at the right time. Luckily, you can swap between the different playable characters in your party. The game is filled with secrets, and you're often rewarded for replaying levels, as you can play as characters that weren't actually there at that point in the movie, and use their special abilities to access hidden goodies. The game also has co-op, which is always a fun time. LEGO Star Wars was developed by Traveler's Tales, known for being a sort of mercenary game dev who makes games for other companies. They've worked on games like the 1995 Toy Story game on Super Nintendo and Genesis, 2004's Crash Twinsanity on the PS2 and Xbox, and 1997 Sonic R on the Sega Saturn. Sonic R is actually in a compilation that came out in 2005, Sonic Gems Collection. Gems Collection is a compilation of many of the underrated, forgotten, and lost Sonic games. The headliners of this collection are Sonic R, Sonic CD from 1993, and Sonic the Fighters from 1996. Strangely, Sonic Gems Collection got a GameCube release in North America, Europe, and Japan, but the PS2 release didn't come to America. I actually did a whole video on Sonic Gems Collection if you're interested in learning more. Gems Collection wasn't the only Sonic game released in 2005, as this year also gave us Sonic Rush on the DS, which was developed by Dimps, who had previously worked on the Sonic Advance series on the GBA, which started in 2001. Sonic Rush introduced the boost ability to the series, allowing Sonic and the new character introduced in this game, Blaze the Cat, to rocket themselves forward with immense speed, barreling their way through enemies. The boost style would become the premier Sonic gameplay style of the late 2000s and early 2010s, so Sonic Rush's impact on the franchise is actually quite notable. The other super iconic part of Sonic Rush is the soundtrack, primarily composed by Hideki Naganuma, who you may know for his music tracks in Jet Set Radio in 2000 and Bomb Rush Cyberfunk in 2023. Basically, if it's a piece of media with stylish, rebellious skaters, there's a good chance Naganuma is going to be involved. Actually, now that I think about it, wasn't there a Sonic game that came out this year about someone who wears skates? Shadow the Hedgehog, aka Shadow 05, was Sonic Team's attempt at making a more mature Sonic game, starring Sonic's air skates wearing rival, Shadow. One of the key features of this game is the ability to choose Shadow's path. Each level has different missions you can complete, like defeating a certain number of enemies or finding an object located within the level. Each mission corresponds to a different alignment: Hero, which is the good guy path, Dark, which is the villain path, and Normal, which is the middle of the road path. The cool thing about Shadow 05 is that completing different alignment missions will actually take you to totally different levels, meaning each playthrough can potentially be a very different experience, leading to a variety of multiple endings. Unfortunately, Shadow 05 is held back by questionable level design, poor writing, and, well, just being a game about a brooding, edgy hedgehog with guns and cursing. One cool piece of trivia is that Shadow 05 is actually one of the earliest games to get an E10+ rating. The E10+ rating was first introduced in 2005. This ESRB rating signifies that a game is for everyone ages 10 and older. For a long time, there was nothing in between E for everyone 6 and up and T for teens ages 13 and up. So I guess the ESRB figured that there should be something in the middle there for games that are a bit more risque than E for everyone, but not quite intense enough to get a teen rating. I like to think of it as a video game equivalent of the PG rating for movies. You can check out my video on video game age ratings if you want to learn more. Another game that got an E10+ rating is Square Enix's Kingdom Hearts 2. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of you saying, wait, didn't KH2 come out in 2006? Well, yes, it did in the West, but in Japan it was first released at the tail end of 2005 in December. For this video, I'm going by the initial release date of the games, so that's the reason why I didn't mention games like Gran Turismo 4 and Pokemon Emerald. Kingdom Hearts is a 2002 Disney and Final Fantasy crossover action RPG platformer, where you play as a boy named Sora who travels across different Disney worlds looking for his lost friends while fighting the forces of darkness, called the Heartless, with his trusty weapon, the Keyblade. After the great success of the first game, it was apparent that a sequel was bound to happen. KH2 infamously starts with you controlling a brand new character, Roxas, instead of Sora from the first game and Chain of Memories. You get to play as Sora later though. Over the years, the sentiment towards the move of having you control someone else at the beginning of the game has become a whole lot more positive, likely helped in part by Roxas becoming a fan favorite character. KH2 places a lot more focus on action and combat, as opposed to the first game, which was more of an action platformer with an emphasis on exploration. While the world design isn't quite as interesting in KH2, the combat in this game is so much more stylish, allowing you to pull off all sorts of crazy moves and combos by stringing different actions together. Another thing that this game has is more Disney worlds to explore. Some notable locales include the Pride Lands from The Lion King, the Land of Dragons from Mulan, and Beast Castle from Beauty and the Beast. Kingdom Hearts 2 is a PS2 classic, but you know what? I feel like I've talked quite a lot about Sony and Nintendo stuff, so let's show Microsoft some love by talking about some Xbox games. 2005 was the debut of the Forza series of racing games, with Forza Motorsport on the Xbox, developed by Turn 10 Studios, a division of Xbox Game Studios that exclusively makes Forza games. Forza was Xbox's answer to the PlayStation's Gran Turismo series. Forza received praise for its realism, customization options, and online multiplayer. Online multiplayer was starting to become a big thing in the 2000s, so it helped that the Xbox came with internet connectivity, unlike the PS2 and GameCube, which required peripherals to connect to the internet. Besides Forza, there were quite a number of racing games that came out for Xbox consoles in 2005. This year also saw the release of Namco's Ridge Racer 6 and Bizarre Creations' Project Gotham Racing 3 as launch titles for the Xbox 360. Ridge Racer 6 is an interesting case, as prior to its release, the Ridge Racer home console games were primarily on PlayStation consoles, with the occasional detour on a Nintendo platform. However, for whatever reason, the Xbox 360 of all things got the first HD entry in the franchise. Actually, I think at this point in time, there was only one other Ridge Racer game on an Xbox console, and that was R Racing Evolution. R Racing Evolution was Namco's attempt at making a more realistic Ridge Racer game. While people were into super stylish over-the-top games in the mid-2000s, at the same time, gaming was starting to become a lot more interested in realism as well. Something that would become more prevalent in the latter 2000s once the 7th generation of consoles went into full gear. Project Gotham Racing 3 is, of course, the third game in Bizarre Creations' Project Gotham Racing series, which was well known for its very detailed recreations of real-life cities like London, Tokyo, and New York City. Bizarre Creations actually had quite a bit of experience with racing games, as they had developed a few Formula 1 games on the PlayStation and Metropolis Street Racer on the Dreamcast, which is something of a spiritual predecessor to the Project Gotham Racing games. One of the neat things about Project Gotham Racing 3 is that it contains arcade machines in the player's garage for Geometry Wars and Geometry Wars Retro Evolved. Geometry Wars was originally included as a minigame in Project Gotham Racing 2, and that game got an expanded sequel called Geometry Wars Retro Evolved, which was a super popular launch title on the Xbox 360's Xbox Live Arcade, a service where you could download games via the internet. These games were typically smaller, cheaper titles you could buy if you had leftover money to throw around. Xbox Live Arcade was on the original Xbox, but the library was pretty small. The 360's Xbox Live Arcade had a much larger lineup of titles. There were modern games like Geometry Wars Retro Evolved, Bejeweled 2, and later Uno. And there were old school games as well, like Joust and later stuff like Street Fighter 2 and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. The popularity of Xbox Live Arcade led to more titles being added to the service, eventually leading to a number of indie games being included as well, like Super Meat Boy and Limbo. I think it's fair to say that Xbox Live Arcade helped usher in the boom of indie games in the late 2000s and early 2010s. I think having a platform for smaller, low-budget games opened the door for indie developers to burst onto the scene. While they weren't Xbox exclusives, some other racing games that sped onto the scene this year were Need for Speed Most Wanted by EA and Burnout Revenge by Criterion Games. As you can see, you had quite a selection of racing titles this year, from a goofy kart racer like Mario Kart DS to a crazy wild vehicular combat racer like Burnout Revenge. Now I think it's time we start wrapping things up. So, let's head on over to the lightning round where I briefly mention a whole bunch of games that I didn't naturally fit into the video. Kirby Canvas Curse is a unique Kirby game by HAL Laboratory where Kirby is a ball and you draw lines on the DS's touchscreen to roll him around. Trauma Center Under the Knife is a DS visual novel simulation game developed by Atlas, where you play as a doctor named Derek Stiles and you perform a bunch of surgeries using the DS touchscreen. It's one of those games that seems like it was just made for the DS. Psychonauts is a platformer developed by Double Fine Productions, where you use the abilities of a psychic boy named Raz to solve puzzles, fight enemies, and explore the minds of various characters dealing with all sorts of emotional problems. From its character design, art direction, and overall vibe, the game really feels like an early 2000s Cartoon Network or Nickelodeon cartoon brought to life as a 3D platformer. The 6th generation of consoles was something of a last dance for the 3D platformer era. 3D platformers never truly died out, as Mario games and the occasional release from another developer kept the genre going even into the 7th generation of game consoles. But 3D platformers weren't quite the same big deal that they once were during the times of Crash Bandicoot, Ratchet and Clank, and Jak and Daxter. Haunting Ground is a survival horror game developed by Capcom. Man, Capcom was just dropping game after game this year, huh? In this game, you play as a young lady named Fiona along with a dog named Huey as she tries to escape a castle filled with all sorts of creepy inhabitants who want her for their own personal gain. Like with 3D platformers, the 6th generation was also something of the end of an era for the classic fixed-angle survival horror game. A lot of the big horror games after this point would have over-the-shoulder third-person or first-person cameras. Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow was developed by Konami, and it was the first Castlevania game to be released on the DS. Dawn of Sorrow continued the trend of 2D Castlevania games being more Metroid-like, which started with Symphony of the Night in 1997. Dawn of Sorrow and other games like it eventually led to the boom of the Metroidvania genre that we'd see in the 2010s with games like Axiom Verge, Hollow Knight, and Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. 2005 was a big year for gaming all around. You had big releases from old IPs, brand new franchises popped up, and we even got the start of a brand new console generation. Obviously, I didn't talk about every game that came out this year, so be sure to let me know what games I forgot to mention in the comments. If you're interested in watching more videos where I talk about stuff, here's a video I did on gaming in 2004, and here's another video you might enjoy. That's all I've got to talk about for today though, so thanks for watching y'all, and have a great rest of your day.